Since 2020, conventional obstetrics and even natural birthing world practitioners have been captured by so much medical tyranny. And yet at the same time, the way our babies are brought into the world is the most impactful for their overall well-being in the short and the long term. For over 13 years, I have been able to clinically measure the impact of birth trauma on our children, and never has it been more of a risk to move through the birthing systems without full consciousness and ownership. Young parents have always asked me about childhood shots for their kids, and we have always been committed to informed consent. Very quickly into 2020, an immediate new question parents would ask in the office was, what about home birth? The demand for a more aligned and conscious birth is greater than ever, and there's significant shortages in aligned providers in our communities, especially birth doulas. The world is waiting for women like you to do the brave and honorable work of holding space for the greatest rite of passage in a woman's life, conceiving and becoming a mother. This is your opportunity. If you're wondering whether doulaship is your path to purpose, with a generous dash of abundance and sustainable success, my good friend and colleague Ayla Cuenca's Uncovering Birth Doula training starts May 15th. Click the link in our show notes for more information on her masterclass, open house Q&A, and this amazing training. Let's save our communities by saving our moms and babies through an empowered birthing experience. The desire to go off-grid and disconnect from the system was one of the single most important initiatives any household could have. Whether it is growing our own food, becoming sovereign in our energy production and usage, establishing alternative communication strategies, or digging a well and finding the infinity of primary water. About a year and a half ago, our family moved into our new home in North County, San Diego, on 3 acres of precious land here in America's finest county. One of the first things we did was hire Food Forest Abundance to design a regenerative layout for our land. From the different trees to plant differing berry guilds and synergistic pollinators, to consulting on alternative energy, collecting our rainwater, and even helping us find our local well guy, Food Forest Abundance and their Freedom Farm Academy has been pivotal in the gradual and consistent evolution of our household towards true sovereignty from the system. They have helped us simplify a very confusing process and helped us create the design of our dreams. It doesn't matter if you have 3 acres, dozens or hundreds, or just a small yard. Food Forest Abundance has something to offer you and your family in your journey to move your entire household off-grid. Use the code TheFutureGen to work with the absolute best in the world, Food Forest Abundance, to create your own freedom farm and get off-grid at a discounted rate. Welcome to another episode of the Future Generations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stanton Hom, and this episode is one of the single most inspiring episodes that I've ever had the honor and pleasure to do. Dr. Kelly Brogan is and has been for many years one of the beacons in my life that have promoted a version of the truth that has always challenged me to think, and it always provided a version of the truth that was more whole. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges today on all sides, right? We know on one side there is a single acceptable narrative, and on the other side, in terms of the freedom side and the sovereignty side, we are vulnerable to the same challenges, our own myopic dogmas. And Dr. Kelly Brogan, in our last interview, gave us a blueprint for what this version of humanity could utilize. And then I've watched her physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, energetically transform and bravely move into new spaces that honestly, in some respects, I was like, wow, I don't know who this person is anymore. And in this conversation, I honestly believe that it is a conversation that maybe only the two of us could have. And what I was left with was a sense of wholeness and peace that I believe only someone like her can navigate. You could go to her past and say, yeah, she's a holistic psychiatrist who stood against, that level of tyranny, who promoted a truth that led me into a greater version of that truth. She could also be referred to as one of the disinformation dozen, one of the few who were deplatformed off of like MailChimp back in the day, that was popularized, obviously, in the modern freedom movement. Or you could see her in the humblest version of herself, but also the very certain and convicted version of herself as she leads into the launch of her book, The Reclaimed Woman. And this book, as she described, essentially addresses the failed promise of feminism. I believe this book to be one of the most important books, and this individual to be one of the most important individuals that has the humble potential to serve and heal humanity in a way that I encourage you to stay to the end of the interview, because there is a moment of a story that she tells that I promise you will help reconcile and heal some of the sometimes deepest traumas that you may ever experience. And it's a simple conversation that in the end, we all have the potential, and I would dare to say responsibility to create and have en masse. It'll heal you. It'll heal your community. It'll heal your family. And I'm deeply inspired to share this episode with you. Love and appreciate you all. Welcome to the Future Generations podcast, providing you with the world-changing content necessary to inspire you, your family, and our planet to a life of optimal health potential. We'll help you make the choices that powerfully influence the lives you bring into this world. It's time to strengthen our resolve of better now and for our future generations. I'm your host, Dr. Stanton Hom. Okay, welcome to another episode of the Future Generations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stanton Hom. I have with me a very special guest, somebody I've known, or at least I have been watching and observing and inspired by and learning from for, I think it's like 10 years now. And in the end, like we just like started this recording 15 minutes later because our worlds overlap in so many ways, and the level of like still, like how you are up leveling and kind of reclaiming, you would say, whether it's sovereignty, whether it's freedom, whether it's your health, whether it's what you're talking about with your new book coming out, The Reclaimed Woman. Kelly, you've been an inspiration to me, and I'm super excited to welcome you back.
Aw, it's so great to be in combo with you again.
I would love our audience to get to know you a little bit more. I know even since the last interview, like there's been such a transformation, and I'd love our audience to get a little bit of that background, because I think it's really important for us, you know?
Yeah. So I have been on what I will euphemistically describe as a magic carpet ride that has felt anything but at many of the dark nights that I've passed through. I'm trying to remember like where we might have left off, because I sort of rested into an avatar of the sort of renegade psychiatrist for a good decade.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very comfortable for me there because I have a big mouth. I'm Italian Irish. I know how to use it. And I had, lots of people telling me how courageous I was and how many lives I was saving. And, here I was like, fighting the good fight against Pharma. And then the pandemic rolls around and I'm like already at the front line.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, see, everyone, I told you what they were doing. And I got all that I told you so schadenfreude that I got to like juice up inside me. And it really worked for a long period of time. That I could, and now I look back, of course, and that I could perpetuate in many ways that which I purported to resolve.
Wow.
So that phrase is something you may hear me say about medications, like about pharmaceuticals, right? So they perpetuate that which they purport to resolve, right? You take an acid blocker, you got worse reflux. You take an antidepressant, you have something called tardive dysphoria, which is a fancy name for permanent depression that was potentially just episodic, right? And this is true for, the dysbiosis that results from antibiotics. It's true across the board. And perhaps it's meant to be true because that is the nature of the zero-sum game, right? Like that is the nature of warfare. That is the nature of imagining that you could win when you're fighting against dimensions of yourself. And, we don't need to get like metaphysical into non-dualism or anything like that. Just to recognize that whenever you're in that kind of tension, even the wins, even the seeming victories are very fleeting. And I would say that most activists on some subconscious level don't actually want the problem that they're fighting to entirely resolve, or at least they can't live into what that would be like. They spend no time like in the imaginal realm of like, what would it be like if everybody just was vital, right? What would it be like if nobody ever touched a pharmaceutical again and the whole industry crumbled to the ground into ashes? We're so in the energy, and I would argue even addicted to the conflict. I call it the erotic caress of the enemy because of how much of your vital force is recruited to be an intimate dynamic, like daily thinking about, dynamic with whomever you have determined is the enemy. And what I began to dedicate myself to, for honestly, like all of the personal crises in my life and relationships, and I was not alone. Like I looked around the activists, frontline, if you want to call them activists that I know, and their lives were like a fucking dumpster fire, one after another. So it was affirming to me that this is an avoidance strategy. And I'm not going to like throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's not that like, my program, Vital Mind Reset, hasn't played a part that's been really important in emancipating people from a mindset of disempowerment. However, there was more work for me to do. And that work I can summarize as being, the maturation beyond victim consciousness, right? So moving into, use the word sovereignty, I like that word too. Moving into adult consciousness. Trust me, I have not arrived. Still in my probably like adolescent initiation, but I'm on my way there. And I have a felt sense of when I am defaulting to victim consciousness programming, which honestly, it's really simple to detect it because I am bitter, resentful, frustrated, right? You and I even did a little complaining before we let the cameras roll. And there's a part of me that watches that.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, and you have choices, Kelly. Like you have choices. You can exercise them. Nobody owes you shit. And until I am in the place where I am taking radical responsibility for my experience, I am not able to feel whole unto myself. And so I bond with parts of myself through resentment, frustration, disappointment, and bitterness on the outside, these projected parts. And then I'm really busy trying to be right about how wronged I am. And I found that all of that work, which sometimes is called shadow work, right? All of that work really followed, the health reclamation work, right? So it's not the destination, right? To reclaim your health from the system is, in my opinion, a very necessary foundational step, to your individuation, actualization as an adult. But the work that could be described as emotional self-mastery is ongoing. It's probably a lifetime. And that's why I have like really tried to simplify what that journey and rinse and repeat process can look like, with like a little phrase I use called entering through the upset. Like that's my spiritual practice these days. Every time I'm upset about something, I set aside sometimes as little as 30 seconds or 90 seconds. And I literally just train my body, my system, to hold the sensation of the upset. That's it. And the training is literally just creating the container, right? So what I mean by that is like setting a timer, making sure sometimes I'll do it in a bathroom, like making sure I have, the privacy I need just for that little window of time. And I'll focus all of my devotional attention on that sensation. Because what I used to do is have a sensation that was a trigger sensation, right? And then immediately discharge it into retaliatory, defensive, proving I'm right and good action. You might be, or somebody listening might be an avoidant, right? I'm an anxiously attached and girly. And avoidance, right? They freeze and they withdraw, right? Their energy from the situation. The mastery comes in to, the equation when you can lean into your non-dominant response and you can be with yourself the whole time, right? So it doesn't actually like serve us to have an experience of like freedom. Like, what even does that mean, right? If we fundamentally cannot even be with ourselves.
Wow.
And, that's a lot of I would say over the past 3 years, the work that I've been doing personally could be described, as this kind of inner work, ending these little wars inside. And what I found is that shame was the gatekeeper of so much vital force energy that once I started to learn how to capacitate shame and just feel it, literally just feel it, because we think it's going to like immolate us and we're going to die, right? Like it's that bad. But once you learn to just feel it, you get to know the warning that it is trying to bring to your awareness. And then there's like all these little surprise gifts, right?
Yeah.
So like weird shit, like I learned how to sew, right? Like I started gardening. I, started dancing, all different kinds of dance. I started singing, right? So these, what I just listed, like that's what a little girl likes to do. All that shit, right? A little girl doesn't necessarily need to be at a podium with 18 degrees that cost her, $200,000 of blood, sweat, and tears behind her. Like I was not serving my soul necessarily through my mission. And there was a reclamation, right? So some people are like, what does that mean? What does reclamation even mean? And I use the word all the time, but it's like a recollection of these parts of yourself that you've buried, that have been buried, or that have otherwise been rejected and disavowed, and often projected onto your enemies and the people you judge. And so like a really powerful practice for me has been to work with judgment, both my judgment of other women and their judgment of me, as a portal, to meet these parts, to meet the part of me that agrees with somebody criticizing me, and to meet the part of me that I'm projecting onto her that I would rather not imagine I am when I am in judgment. And so I collect all these different parts and I have more and more aliveness available to me, which I do think, at least for a lot of women, is the goal, is feeling that energy very available, in our systems.
I think it's there's so many things. I mean, just starting with where our conversation ended last time, it was mostly, I think you were maybe through that, maybe not shedding, but maybe like what you're talking about, like this kind of shifting into from that holistic psychiatrist where we, like when you were on Rogan, that immediately became a, like our curriculum in our community, because it was like, whoa, like you're at this precipice of this alternative media world. And it's this figure that we've always kind of looked to for that truth and that beacon. And then you get to that maybe precipice and then you recognize like, whoa, like there's a lot of shit here. Like there's, this is about to be treacherous, And I would say I experienced that too, like you get to this level where you've communicated, you become a figure here, especially in San Diego, like an in-person brick and mortar pediatric chiropractic practice. Like you think that there's this like, oh yeah, you made it. And then there's a trail of shit that happens in your life, and you don't recognize that you are promulgating the system. Like you're bringing it, you're recreating the system because you're still antagonizing. And it's not to say that you shouldn't call out the evils and those types of things. But one of my mentors very early on in practice would always say, our job is to work ourselves out of the job. Our job is to work into our obsolescence. But how many of us really own that? Like in the end, I think you are potentially going to give us one of those blueprints, right? Where if we really do believe in health freedom, then I actually need to educate, inspire, empower people to never need me, like to never need me. And it's an interesting dynamic, because I would say a lot of people are on this search, and I think you're talking about this path that you've been on, and then all of a sudden you come back to like a remembering and a reclamation. And I think Alec posted something recently about that too. And that's something that I've been really thinking about for at least 20 years now. It's like, we're not discovering, we're uncovering. Like we're on this search for this something outside of us, not recognizing that eventually we're just going to absolve all of our responsibility to that something outside of us, when in reality, maybe what you're learning is that we're turning back to what's actually already there. And we've maybe disavowed. It's crazy.
Yeah. There's a lot of humility, I guess is the word that comes to me, required to see more clearly. And, in neurobiology, it's called neuroception, which is like the perception of safety in the environment, right? And, I often give the example that when your neuroception is like trauma influenced, you might see a pile of clothes in the corner of your bedroom and think it's like an intruder, right? And we do this in relationships. We do this over an email exchange, right? Like we perceive unsafety where it's not actually inherently present, because we are projecting, shit from the past onto our present. And then we live in a scary world. So the process of seeing more clearly requires that you heal and integrate that, and learn how to confer safety to your system, which is a lot of what I, endeavor to teach women, and have had to learn myself, because I lived so long hoping and praying it would come from the outside, right? Like from the partner, from the system, from, even the team that I'm, running a business with. And I didn't want to hear that it was an inside job, especially as a woman. Like I wanted it to be done for me. And a lot of what I had to look at, surprisingly, in this process was the angle. Okay, so the victim triangle, the Karpman triangle, is like the villain, the rescuer, and the victim. There are different words for it, but that's what I use. And in sort of probably the circles that we run in, there's not a lot of room for victim speech, right? Like, poor me, this sucks. I can't believe this is happening. Like, we don't really speak that way. It's not cool. However, where we hide in our consciousness is in the rescuer angle, right? So if you're a healer or a facilitator or a practitioner, an activist, a change maker, a light worker, all these kinds of euphemistic terms, it's imperative, in my opinion, that you examine your motives, right? And that you look at the covert motives, right? Because what you might find is that there's all sorts of under the cover exchanges happening in what looks like altruism, philanthropy, and saving the world. And as a practitioner, that's why I closed my practice, because navigating the dyad, especially as an MD, which is so loaded with parental authority energy, right? It was challenging to the point of generating codependency, right? When I moved to a community-based model, online, I started seeing faster and more history-making outcomes nearly immediately, like the first launch of Vital Mind Reset. So what I learned is that, like, there are a lot of needs that are met, right? So when you're saying like it should be our goal for people to, leave the practice, which was absolutely, my intention as well. The needs that are being met through the relationship for the practitioner are real, right? We get to feel like a savior, we get to feel powerful, we get to feel superior in many ways. And that kind of help, quote unquote, also shows up for women in marriage, right? When, or in long-term partnership, where you're like, oh, I know better how he should do this. I'm just going to give him a little help, right? I'm going to just like give him my perspective. It's helpful. And sometimes men even ask women, like, honey, what do you think I should do with this business decision, right? And it seems so benign, but I actually think it's at the root of like a very, contaminated experience of what is possible through complementary relationships, right? So anytime there's a power hierarchy, we can bring a lot of consciousness to it and awareness, or we can just sort of like go with the flow and pretend like that's not actually what's going on. So the covert exchange is like, you need to see me a certain way, you need to agree with me, you need to do the things I'm telling you, you need to appreciate it. And I even priced my consultations in New York when I practiced at a level that if somebody didn't appreciate the time and effort and passion and attention that I gave to them, it would feel fine. Like it would still feel balanced. Wow. That's actually how I advise, that people consider pricing, their one-on-one work, let's say, so that there isn't a covert exchange that you have to be appreciative or, follow through in a particular way. And so I have started to look at all of the efforts that we make to do good in the world as meeting needs that are maybe better met elsewhere, maybe not.
Interesting.
Right. But at least if right, like I'm doing this podcast because I like to feel, important, because I like to feel significant. I like to feel influential. I like attention, right? Like versus like I'm doing this podcast because I know that somebody listening is going to have an experience of meaningful change in their life because of me. And I just want to pay it forward. That could also be true. But to deny the part of me that has very primal needs that are covertly being met, it's just problematic, and it creates conflict and unfulfillment. And it is part of that, sort of victim triangle merry-go-round, because it's very easy to slip into the victim and the villain role from the rescuer. Right. So like a lot of the activists that you and I know who imagine that they're here to save the world look way more like a villain. Right. And in many ways, as Nietzsche said, like become the monster they're fighting than somebody who's just minding their own damn business. Right. And tending to the matters in their actual, the three-dimensional life. So I found that like cleaning all this stuff up and getting very real with myself about my, covert intentions, really reorganized my lifescape in a way that created the space for play and creativity and expansion, even of my perception and my superpowers and all the rest, because there was so much energy being drained in these, victim consciousness oriented dynamics that are really normative. Like they really, really are, even in the sort of like, holistic integrative spaces that we're in.
It's I've been talking to a lot more chiropractors lately than I have in the past, and I think mostly because I was focused on activism, focused on the community, focused on grassroots. And I will hear people say like, oh yeah, like 2020 and 2021 were like the best for business. But on the opposite end, demonizing, right? Demonizing the thing that was being promoted. Obviously, we know like what level of evil.
Playing the victim is so common.
It's an interesting dynamic, right? Because their business grew, right?
I mean, and not to say that I'm better than somebody who doesn't do that, but I've been very open about how excited I was to make the disinformation doesn't listen. How I don't want to participate in any sort of class action suit because I had already been wiped off the algorithm, and it was like the most click juice I had in years. It was fucking great for me. And absolutely, like the martyr, right? So the martyr is a very recognizable flavor of the victim triangle, and that energy, because I've been deplatformed, all the things. And once in a while, I just said it, right? So once in a while, I'll pepper that in, and it could be because it, makes me feel a certain way. And there are activists for whom that's like their entire agenda is like, look how persecuted I am. Give me donations into my membership box. And like, listen, do your thing. But that is felt. It's felt, and it's a resonance, right? So like, if we are actually in the business because it's fucking fun to watch of transformation, like, I'm not sure what's more delightful than like watching somebody change their story. It's just fun. Like, I'd watch that in a movie, I'd read it in a book, and I certainly love doing it for a living, right? If that's actually our business, when we speak to somebody who is at the point where they say, enough, I am no longer spending one more second in this story, all we have to do is like blow a little fairy dust on them, and they like are a phoenix, right? But if we speak to the people who are just sort of like stirring in the shit, right? In divided will, as it's sometimes called, right? Like in this split, sort of like getting my needs met from complaint and, virtue signaling, and also sort of curious about what else could be possible for me in this life. Like, they are the lifetime customers, because they're the professional patients, because they're not actually at that point of readiness. And I've studied readiness for so many years, and I can't say I really understand what makes somebody ready to change, other than that when you are ready to change, and it doesn't matter if it's, leaving the job, leaving the city you live in, leaving the marriage, leaving the identity, letting the license go, like whatever it looks like. It's just that walking in the direction of change feels like relief, even though most of the time the barrier is terror, right?
Yeah.
So there's so many reasons not to move into the unknown territories. But I found that it is a relief, and I don't know what makes somebody ready or not. But I do know that there's entire businesses, in the health and wellness space that are oriented towards pain. I've been that business, but that's also how I know, and it's a very different thing to really invest in people who are ready to change their story.
I respect that, where you might not know when someone's ready, but when someone is, then what is it that you see as whether it's strategies, process, etc., to kind of two parts. One, kind of maybe facilitate that for them, or maybe just create the opportunity and hold the space for them. And then the question I have maybe secondarily is like, what about our kids? Because I think we perpetuate that, right? With our kids in ways that, whether our parenting style or just we don't recognize how we've promoted that triad, right? And we've essentially socially integrated them into that same dynamic. I'd love to know what you...
Oh gosh, I love that you asked me that. I have so much to say about that. And yeah, I would say that in answer to your question about like, what does somebody who is ready need? The answer that I have found to be, true in every instance that I've encountered, including my own, is permission. And I call it a permission field, which is actually a term I learned from the BDSM world, conscious kink world. And it's very powerful to me because I witnessed it, right? So the patients that I worked with who had extraordinary, reclamation experiences, from like 5 meds they were on for 25 years, multiple hospitalizations, like a laundry list of diagnoses, who are now, almost a decade out, doctor free. Okay. They will affirm, especially the ones who have public, platforms, like Alizek, for example, will affirm that I was the first to say there's nothing wrong with you. Like, that's all I did. So yes, I have a protocol. The protocol is a ritual. And that's what I would say is the second ingredient. You need permission from somebody who is the right medium. Right. So in my feminine reclamation process, in fact, I put on an event called Audacious Embodiment in November where I put 10 women on stage who gave me permission. And every time I introduced them, I was like snot down my face crying because it was so moving to me to revisit the moment before I had their permission to be a little bit of a different kind of a woman and still be myself.
Wow.
Right. To sing in this way, to dance in this way, to create in this way, to set boundaries in this way, right? And each of them held out a hand in the dark for me and said, you can do it. Here's where we're going, right? And the second ingredient I would say is the ritual. There is something in the nature of human consciousness where ritual is part and parcel of how we render change sacred and lasting, right? And it doesn't mean permanent, but it means it is not like now you're in a new plateau of reality. And that's what I realized, my health protocol is it's literally just a ritual because there's not a ton that is unique about it, special about it, in terms of lifestyle information. It's a permission field where I am very clear about, the good news and the bad news is there's nothing fucking wrong with you and there never has been. Now what? Okay. Right. Because that means you don't get to play in the triangle anymore. Right.
Wow.
And here's the ritual for self-initiation. And I've needed that both for health. And I would say I was like initiated primarily by my mentor, Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez. And then, for my sexuality, my femininity, my experience of embodiment as a woman, I needed a whole stage full of women,
Wow.
to initiate me into that space. So, when it comes to our kids, God, humbling. It's like the humility that I have, been invited to really embody is extraordinary. And it's interesting because as I started to explore the shadow of activism, that I am talking about. In fact, I did a masterclass on it recently, just sort of like what I have learned as somebody who's recovering from that identity. But as I started to explore that, one of the major arenas where I could see the shadow was in my mothering, right? So in the ways that I offered my children conditional love based on compliance and obedience with my definition of what was healthy, right? So whether that's how they relate to technology, how they relate to their bedtime, what, because my girls are teenagers now, what, cosmetics products they're buying, and let alone food and nutrition. Like that was the real hill I was ready to die on. It was like, I don't need any other rules, but you're not eating gluten and dairy, kind of a thing. And there were some rumbles that I was able to recognize because I already had been doing, the kind of work that I detail in this book that I have coming out, this kind of inner work. I could recognize the rumbles.
Wow.
And I have girlfriends who can help hold me when I might otherwise collapse, right? Who could say like, you can handle this, Kelly. Like, for example, I got off my smartphone in 2020 as a part of like, the whole experience of playing with different flavors of sovereignty, right? Also because I felt like rather shamefully addicted to the gadget, right? So I decided, okay, I'm going to do this. And I'm a very willful gal, right? So I'm like, I'm going to do this. I do it. So I get onto this like sort of hipster flip phone called a light phone for 2 years. So I do that for 2 years. And, I'm not traveling during that time. So it wasn't like heroic, but I did learn to like sit and wait for a friend just looking around, like I did learn how to relate to my productivity differently. I did learn how to like be still in a way, be bored even in a way that I hadn't had access to in a while. Okay. So in the end of this window, my then 13-year-old says, Mama, I want an iPhone. Okay. So they had been like in a Waldorf school prior to, the pandemic and everything else. And I was like, well, we don't have iPhones. Do I have an iPhone? We don't have iPhones in this house. That's not a thing. You're not having an iPhone, goodbye. And she is, my kids are just amazing. It's just epic, epic little women. And she just very self-possessed, very self-assured. She says, Mama, I'm at a stage where I know what works for me. And she literally said that. And I didn't. So I exited the conversation. I go talk to one of my friends. So this is why I'm such a huge believer in men having men and women having women. Like, it's necessary. It is essential, right? Mm-hmm. And your partner is not that. Okay. So your same sex crew, I believe is essential, so I call one of my friends and she's like, Kelly, you have to give her the iPhone. I was like, what are you talking about? No way. Like, maybe I'll give her like an above phone or like some other variant, and she helped me to recognize that this was the fork in the road, right? Where I could power over, right? And impose my reality on hers for her own good, right? Or I could allow her to learn to trust her own compass, to have a resistance-free experience of her choices, and remain connected.
Wow. And
that's what I did. And there were several ensuing examples where I continue to allow my daughters to make choices and decisions that I wouldn't necessarily consider like the most healthy or holistic. I would say, especially with food, that I realize brings up fear in me. Okay. So this is like when you have a family member who like doesn't want to do the health thing the way you want them to, and then you end up acting like a total asshole, like trying to control them. And that's supposed to be love. Like, that's not love. That's fear and control. So I was able to see all of the ways that I needed them to conform to my reality. Otherwise I would withdraw love from them and be angry and bitter and disappointed, or I would try to like impose, which again, you have to feel into, right? As a parent, like, when is that transition? Because, my daughters are not initiated in any meaningful way, but there was a moment where I could see if I continued to do my old shtick. Like, another example is they decided they wanted to go back to school. Okay, apparently I did not win the homeschooling award. So they decided they want to go back to school. And I was like, okay, fine. But every other Sunday, we're going to have Kelly school. And I'm going to pick a topic and I'm going to teach you. I'm going to teach you about, true Earth cosmology. I'm going to teach you, about the truth about evolution and dinosaurs. I'm going to teach you about how germ theory is, a hoax. I'm going to teach you all the things, right? And they went along. But then I also taught them other things like, Kaja Urbaniak's work on like how to ask for what you want and, sort of like basic other, whatever's interesting, how to make flower remedies. So we do this for like, I don't know, a year or something. And at a certain point, my little one was like, I don't want to do this anymore. And you tell me that I shouldn't have to do anything I don't want to do, which is true. I've had that ethos since they've been little girls. It hasn't always been easy, but ultimately it's like actually very powerful that we all just do exactly what we want to do. And we can trust that we're making decisions from that place. So she said, I don't want to do it anymore. And I was like, well, our agreement is if you go to this school, then I have to at least expose you to the other perspective. You can't Google it anymore. So how the hell are you going to ever know? And she's like, you see, you always make it about how you feel when I tell you that, I want to do something different. And I felt so indicted. I actually started crying. I felt so indicted in that moment because I was like, oh, fuck. Like, that is the narcissistic parent, right? Who needs you to comply with what regulates their system. And then if you don't, it's about their feelings, right? About how you're not doing that. And so I dropped it and I lived to see another day. Right? And so I've softened in all of these arenas, and it's allowed me to see that, I can only inspire, right? At this point, I can only inspire my girls with my decisions, and give them one perspective on how to live in this human body, because the alternative is greenwashed, control-based conditional parenting. It's literally the same energy. And it comes from fear. In fact, one of my daughters said to me at one point, I'm like, Mama, you're afraid of so much stuff. And I'm like, meanwhile, I think I'm like some Joan of Arc, rescuing our mother line or whatever from the trenches. And, then I'm like, the chemtrails, the injectables, the pesticide, it can be felt that way. And when it's felt that way by people that are close to you, it's worth looking at. So, at this point, my relationship with my daughters, it's literally like the most joyful dimension of my entire life is hanging out with them, spending time with them, traveling with them. They're just the fucking best. Yeah. And I don't know that I would be able to say that, especially in the high school years, if I hadn't done this inner work of holding myself, and not only what it is to have somebody that I love so much live a different, slightly, in the end, different reality, but also to grapple with what I have made it mean, which is that I have failed, right? Yeah. And then I haven't actually succeeded at convincing them to do the thing, or I haven't actually succeeded, at getting them to see, and that is no longer my priority. My priority is to have intimacy with these humans I hope to have a lifelong relationship with. And they also happen to first of all, be right most of the time. They help me to see where I had blind spots and I was really limited. And that's given me permission to, to circle back to the permission thing, to really soften in a lot of ways that I was becoming dogmatic and rigid. I believe in discipline. I believe that it's essential that you have an initiation to yourself where you actually show up, with responsibility and,
virtually
you do the
every
damn
leader
thing
in
of
the health
taking care of yourself.
Talks
but
about
if
the
that overstays
of the
energetically,
as one of the
it
primary
starts
avenues
to
of tyranny.
really
Our family
contaminate
has
a lot of
rigorously
dynamics,
sourced our foods for over a decade, and one of our favorite sources is Farm Match. And specifically, if you are in San Diego, Real Food Club PMA. My kids are literally made from their maple breakfast sausage and the amazing carnitas we make from their pasture-raised pork. But from regeneratively raised raw dairy products to the organic potato chips made in regenerative lard, or anything you might get at your local farmer's market, our family's overall wellness and the security of our food lies in the hands of Farm Match and Real Food Club. I am so excited to be sharing about Farm Match and Real Food Club to offer Future Generations podcast listeners 10% off your first order. You can find the code and link in the show notes. Enjoy the rest of the show. Love and appreciate you all. So many people have asked me what I do to stay mentally and physically resilient in the midst of the unending polarization, fear, and tyranny. Literally nothing has made a bigger impact for me than daily cold plunging. 3 minutes, 37 degrees every morning for over a year now. My friends, I wanted to tell you about the Edge Tub from Edge Theory Labs. Their portable and inflatable tub can alternate between an ice bath and hot tub. I've been regenerating the benefits of cold plunging every day, like better sleep, better focus, and more energy. We have had some really amazing interviews to learn more about cold exposure. But in the meantime, I invite you to check out Edge Theory Labs' website to learn more. I'm also happy to share an exclusive offer for Future Generations podcast listeners, $150 off using the code TheFutureGen. You can find more info in the show notes. Get cold. What's up, FG fam? One of the single best companies whose products have supported the optimal wellness of our family for years is Earthly Wellness. Kate TG and her team have stood for truth, health, and freedom in ways that paved the way for so many of us. They experienced heavy levels of censorship long before it was popularized, and they stood strong and persevered. Their products are clean, cost-effective, and honestly, they work for all ages. From supporting my wife, our oldest, and our little guy, Earthly Wellness provides products that have been foundational for our family for years. We especially use their products right before bedtime. Their Feel Better Fast and other herbal tinctures are some of the best in the world, as well as their amazing Goodnight Lotion, the magnesium oil, are mainstays. I am so excited to be partnering with Earthly to offer future generations podcast listeners 10% off your first purchase. You can find the code link in the show notes. Enjoy the rest of the show. Love and appreciate you all. Is this like a ubiquitous blueprint? A part of it is like freeing, right? To be like, okay, I don't have to dictate so much, quarterback everything. But what if it like flies like in the face of something that you have, like say like SSRIs, right? Or like the HPV shot, like
it's a good question.
Like I'm curious about that because I feel called to, like, I know that as a parent, I got a 4 and a 2-year-old, and it's a little different, maybe to some degree.
Yes,
save their life. My daughter likes to plummet places sometimes. And it's like, okay, you stay, don't die. But I'm curious what that kind of looks like when it's something that is like, for me, it's like, I had 5 anthrax shots and it's like, you're not going to West Point, like these things, like that's what my wife used to ask me before. It's like, would you, like if Alana wanted to go to West Point back in the day, it was like, well, I would make sure that she was fully informed, and then me and Alec do the interview about them, quarantining 30 new cadets and the, medical officer, the colonel threatening to plunge, needles in their arms, leveraging graduation, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, she's like, so what do you think about that now? And I'm like, oh, hell no, and now like, there's no way my kid's going to go to that indoctrination camp, but I'm curious, like, and obviously I'm going into the extreme, but I think that's kind of where we have
been. And I think, first of all, I don't want my kids to go to college at all, period. Also because I enjoy, digital entrepreneurship, and it's an amazing opportunity in life and all the things, right? So I'm like, why would you waste your time in like a neoliberal brainwashing camp, to the tune of $400,000 of debt? Like what? So you could hang out with your homies? Like there's got to be another arrangement. And I already kind of blew it. I already blew it because I came in with a little bit of like, I have to convince you energy, right? If I had played it cool.
Yeah.
If I had played it cool and been like, I don't know, like it's something to think about. I know for sure that the two of them wouldn't be gunning for Harvard. Okay. Wow. Like, which is actually, so it's a lot of understanding polarity energetics, right? And being, right. So I think, of course, mothers and fathers have a different role, right? But if my role is to offer them the experience of being totally approved of, right? Nurtured and loved, right? So I think of a mother wound is that basic, like, I am not lovable. Whereas like, I think of a father wound as being like, I am not safe.
Wow.
Right. So this is just my, the way I make sense out of it. So if that's my job, in my energy, right, is coming from a place of like, you better get in line, kind of a thing. It's just not experienced as love, right? So there's work that I have to do to understand what is it that I'm actually afraid of. But then there's also, right? So like, I don't have to fund that. I have choices, right? So I can support them and say, listen, I don't agree with this. And if you're going to do it, whatever. And, but I don't have to fund it, right? So like there are ways where you feel into your boundaries so that it's not child-led parenting either, right? It's sovereign love. It's like, I see you, I understand you, like I'm fucking here for you. Okay. That's all we wanted from our moms, right? But then I think of like the dad comes in like 10 and up to show you how to be in the world. Right. And, me and their dad are separated, although we co-parent, even though we don't agree on a lot of things, we co-parent very well together. And I'm super blessed and grateful for that reality. Nonetheless, like I recognized that I had never actually sat my girls down and taught them or offered them the opportunity to learn about, chemicals in cosmetics, about the food industry, about, pharmaceuticals. I was just the whole time being like, that's bad. This is good. That's bad. This is good. You do the good, I love you. You do the bad, I'm mad. Like it was like cave girl mothering. Okay. And it never occurred to me to sit down and curate the best documentary, for each of those topics and like sit down and then like have a chitty chat about it. And I started doing that, probably when they were like 11, 12, 13. And I hadn't before, but that's how you prepare them, offer them information, hopefully like, that they're somewhat interested in so that they can make their own decisions. Right. And if you as the dad are in charge of making sure they're ready to go out in the world and make their own decisions, then yeah, it is incumbent upon you to determine how to deliver that, right? By the time your kids are that age, you're going to have to find like the most bomb ass TikTok because that's the only attention span they're going to have. You're going to be like, okay, give me 30 seconds. I'm going to tell you why to never get an injection. But there's creativity in it too, right? Because like you can't just have this boilerplate, like, here's why read Kelly's book, right? They're not reading my book. Okay. They're just not going to read my book. My own kids are not reading my book. Your kids are not reading my book. So like, maybe we do a podcast where we like hit the points in 15 minutes kind of a thing, right? So you have to get creative so that you can actually attune to your audience. And I have not had the experience. What I've actually learned is that my daughters trust themselves. When they say no, they mean no. When they say yes, they mean yes. I mean, this is literally what my entire book is about, is like reclaiming the no and the yes for middle-aged women. Okay. Like myself, this has been a journey of epic proportions, like learning how to honor your no. What does it feel like? How do you express it? Right. And then aligning with your desire and your yes and learning how to hold yearning in your body. Like they already know that. Like my daughter is in a relationship. She's been in a relationship for over a year. Literally their relationship is arguably the healthiest romantic relationship I have in my entire lifescape. I am not even kidding. They know how to repair. They know how to communicate. Like he's super chivalrous. It's just, they're good. That's cool. Right. So like if you see, it's like that Martin Buber, like I thou gaze, right? Like if you see, which I know, you're with this, like if you see their actual divinity, and I don't mean that in like a trite new age way, like literally, like you're visited by God, the Godhead, when you interact with this kid. If you feel like the preciousness of mortality, like you allow death to be an advisor. Like one day my daughter got out of the car, pissed at me because I said something shitty. I teased her a little bit, whatever. And later I was like, I never want to do that again, because you could die or I could die, and it's not going down that way. Right. And I live this way, like every time I interact with them, and it just drains any potential, like, I mean, we don't fight, but like any potential like irritability or whatever out of the field. So the reclamation of that can only come when you're out of that power over authoritarian, you better respect me, like you better help out in the house. My children do not do chores. They do not do shit that they don't want to do in the house. Nothing. They never have. And it works. You know what? The rooms are always clean. They are so independent and so self-sufficient. I'm sure any homeschooler, unschooler would tell you this too, right? Like your kids develop intrinsic motivation when they're not doing shit because they're scared of you, or they think they're only going to get your love if they act like the good kid.
Wow.
So there's just a lot of like defragging of this programming that we can do. And I'm very passionate about, mothering, right? Like mothering differently from a different place, of not imagining that we necessarily know better. Because isn't that what we want them to know? Like, and somehow grow into is like, I actually know what's best for me. Like, when does that happen though? Like when they go to college, just magically on a Wednesday, right? Like, how is that enculturated? When do you start to actually give them permission to own themselves? Right? Like, last thing I'll say is I put out, my last book is called Own Yourself, right? And around the time that it came out, I was like big into like a lot of new agey shit. And I wanted to always go to these like ecstatic dance circles, right? So I wanted my kids to come because I'm like, oh my God, like, no woman in my mother line like ever really danced. And I think it's so important for us to like dance together, like, mother and daughters. And I want you to come so bad. And I really had in my mind, I was like, this is what like a healed mother does with her kids. Like I had this like narrative in my head, right? Like, this is good. Okay. They didn't want to go. They didn't want to go. And I was like, no, you're coming. It's mandatory ecstatic dance. Okay. So they literally drew a sign, like a poster board sign that said, own yourself. And it was like all these little like statements about why they should never be forced to do something that they don't actually want to do. And it was like literally like quotes from me delivered back to me. So yeah, be careful what you put out in the world, because it could come back to bite you in the ass.
So tell us about The Reclaimed Woman. I'd love to know more about this book, especially just given, just in observation of your very like physical and energetic transformation. I think it's been very inspiring. It's been very like, what is happening, but I think that's the truth behind it, right? Because it's you reclaiming yourself. It's you kind of taking that level of, dare I say ownership, but I'd love to know like what this book is all about.
Yeah. So it's meant to provide a path beyond a lot of what I call the poor bargain of feminism.
Yeah.
Which is to suggest that when we can do what a man can do, bleeding, right? Or on the placebo week of our birth control pills or whatever. When we have achieved, produced, or otherwise engaged in corporate life, right? The way that men do. And we are not beholden to our biology, right? So we don't have to bleed when we don't want to. We don't have to have babies naturally if we don't want to. We certainly don't have to, have them encumber our mission. And of course, that you could take it further into trans agendas and all this stuff.
Yep.
But the burden of the female body has now been relieved of you, and you finally can feel free, right? And as a single mom, who has a very successful business, I can tell you, as you referenced earlier, that, it's not what we're told, right? Like the fulfillment that I was promised as a good neoliberal feminist is not actually to be found when you take it to its full extent, right? So I have developed tremendous, what I would now call masculine competencies, right? Where I am more organized, more effective, better at executing, problem solving, clear thinking than most people in my lifescape, right? And I can do all the things. Like, I don't need a man. I actually don't. I've been living without one for years, right? Like, I don't need one. And so I should be like a crown jewel of feminist outcomes. And what I found was that the rejection of my literal soul, right? The betrayal of my heart, and the gaslight that says I should feel free and happy was too profound for me to sit with for a second longer. So I had one of those moments where I was like, this, I'm calling this. Okay, this is just some bullshit, and it's time for us to progress the conversation. And what I found was that, the struggle, the problem that feminism promised to solve. And of course, I can talk all conspiracy theory with you that, feminism has nothing to do, the agenda, the political movement that is feminism, feminism literally has nothing to do with supporting women, and has everything to do with breaking up the family, indoctrinating children, taking them out of the home, and making taxpayers out of women, and creating a war between the sexes that wages, on today, decades later. But what I found was that the solution was never addressing the actual problem. And I think if I were to summarize the actual problem that most women are struggling with, and how do you know you're struggling? You feel bitter, resentful, disappointed. You feel like you're living behind a glass wall, right? Like there's whole dimensions of this experience of being a woman that you're not accessing, but they're there, and you're finger pointing all the people who are responsible for why you're not fulfilled, right? The problem that we struggle with is unsafety. It's unsafety, right? That we have a longing to feel safe and contained, right? To feel that we can finally exhale, right? And allow that energy to move through creatively. And we serve by our natures, right? We pay it forward by our natures. We are, natural caregivers. And that has been commodified when you look at the roles and jobs that women are paid to do for strangers rather than serving their families. We have engaged like quite a poor bargain. So the reclamation is the process of learning how to generate safety in your own body so that you can feel your no and you honor it. Because every poor bargain that's ever made, there's a little no inside of you that says, hey, wait a minute. Is this really the thing? Is this really going to work? Is this really best? And you ignore that. You suppress awareness of that. You buy the dress you never wear. You marry the guy who was never right for you. You pursue the career even when, something inside of you has been screaming for, years and years and years. You stay in the city, your body is like, please move. Right? Maybe I'm speaking for myself. How long I spent in New York before I moved to Florida. And that reclamation of no, owning that no is a process. And it requires things like, I call them, learning how to wear the villain crown, like learning how to be bad and wrong. It's a physiologic thing you can learn and practice. And I like to show, women how to do that also by my example. Entering through the upset that we mentioned, right? So really learning how to take these opportunities of shitty things happening in your life and alchemizing them, and really starting to smoke out where your victim story is throbbing and you're getting your needs met indirectly through these dynamics. And then, so moving on into how do you work with your desire, right? How do you ask for what you want? How do you begin to understand why you either don't have what you want or you don't know what you want? Like, this is pretty much how we relate to desire as women. It's like in protest or confusion.
Wow.
And there's a lot to reclaim in that arena that I've had so much help and beautiful guidance with. And I'm a curator in the end, right? So I love to collect, resources, distill them down, make them practical and usable, and create, the path and the journey of transformation that I've witnessed. I'm able to, perhaps through that permission field, hand down to other women.
That's amazing. It's almost like I've understood, like my thing is always like trying to understand the landscape, like to see how the ecosystems work together. And I would say that I've been stuck, and I've been stuck because there are some things that just haven't been fluid. And then, I get to have this conversation with you, which I have no idea what we're going to talk about. I had an idea because I have watched you, we're connected in different ways. And then all of a sudden, I think you've done for me something that, and this is not me pedestalizing you, right? This is me recognizing that that there's always been like this beacon, right? And it's always like this, I used to call them bridges, like these bridges towards sovereignty. And then it's like, well, where are you going? What's the actual destination? Now I'm like, oh, is it ladders, right? Is it ladders, and are we ascending, or are we just really just going within? I don't know what the actual like, metaphor is, but I believe what you just shared in the last hour has kind of put in place a lens that has helped me kind of view into the landscape a little bit more whole, because I would say you're speaking to me through that lens, where I am still very involved in the activism. I'm still in that triad to some degree, and I still feel myself like called to communicate in a specific way, not recognizing, maybe not really fully seeing like the need that I'm fulfilling for myself, but then also recognizing like maybe it's not black and white, and maybe it is just this journey of transformation that I have to give myself permission into, kind of moving into new rituals.
100%. I'm so glad you brought that up, because one of the most important things that I have learned in my process is not to vilify my past self, and and now I can very authentically do this. Like, I can look at the so-called unawakened version of me and like be really unsure of whether like it's actually better now. I don't know, right? I have more awareness, I have more choices, but like this is not a spiritual meritocracy. And the angry bitch activist version of me was absolutely essential. I played a very specific role for myself and my family and, the collective. And there are no accidents. There is nothing actually wrong. Like, that's how I choose to live. So if you apply that also to yourself in the way that you did, then you say, now here's where I am. Right? Because we could look back, like when we learn how to better relate, right? Like, I've taken a deep, deep dive into a woman's role as a wife, right? And what that actually means. Like, nobody ever fucking told me that. I never talked to a single woman about that before I got married 2 times. Okay. I never understood, my power as a wife to create the conditions of fulfillment in the relationship. And I have since learned so much about this. Also very humbling. And I could look back and be like, oh God, I wish I had known. If only I had known, it would. That's how it was.
Yeah.
It was meant to be exactly that way. Mm-hmm. And however it is right now, it's meant to be exactly this way. And by the way, I'm speaking to you. I love speaking to you. I'm sure you have men in the audience. I don't know about being a man. I know nothing about being a man at all. Being a father, being a man who's an activist, who's a businessman. I know literally nothing about that. So I can only speak as a woman what I have observed when we, make a career out of vilifying and rescuing, mm-hmm. which is what I did. And it's juicy, it's fun, and it's exciting. And there might be a time where you're like, hey, what's next? And I'm like, here's my book. here's what's next, when you're ready to end the wars. And I talk a lot about like the imperative to end the war within, right? Your 2 polarities, your, dictatorial, you could say narcissistic, controlling, fear-based inner masculine, right? Flagellating inner masculine, and your histrionic, like, cowering, anxious inner feminine, right? Like, how do you mature those and this war inside of you so that you know how to, what I call, self-husband and creatively express? Then what happens is holofractal, is you end the war with men on the outside. And that's been, the natural progression for me, is to see that, in romantic relational dynamics, even in, dynamics with my family of origin, interacting with random men in the world, that I was in a very superior place where I felt that I knew better, ultimately, than pretty much every man I interacted with. And sometimes it seemed innocent, but most of the time it was actually just disrespectful. Wow. And that I don't want to live in a world with emasculated men who are apologizing to women for their very existence. That's not a safe world for me. And if safety is the imperative, then what can I do to, like, lift men up? And as one of my teachers, Omrapani, would say, like, press the green light on every single man I interact with, not, to be a pick me girl or like some sort of like, but to actually create a safer world for myself, and understanding that the currency of admiration, respect, you know, and this kind of regard from a woman to a man is part of the natural contract. We never would have remembered that, as you said, right? And I'll end with this little story about my handyman, right? So I have like a house husband handyman who's really been so helpful and supportive to me over the years, for many years. And he was telling me about his son, right? And he's like, "Oh, my son is thinking about becoming a welder." And he's like, "It's like really lucrative." Right? Whatever that is, means to him. It's really lucrative, but it's also like super dangerous, apparently, right? Like when you're at this certain echelon of that craft, I don't know. And I said to him, I was like, when I walk around these days, like I see construction sites and I see men working and I see like all this infrastructure of society that men built. And I smile at my feminist programming that says, I don't need a man. And the extraordinary gaslight that is required to really believe that, as you're living in a world made by men who are, by statistical definition, suffering, right? And struggling with risk and danger far more than we are. And that's not to, exclude awareness of like the 1% of men who are controlling all the shit, but we're all in a mess. Okay. It's all of us. It's across the sexes. Okay. And so I'm telling him all this. And he says to me, he just looks at me, he says, "We do it all for you."
Wow.
It makes me cry every time I say it, because I just was like so fucking touched, because I felt like the restoration of the contract. It's like, I just get to be a woman, and by existing, I inspire men to be the brave, courageous, heroic servants that they are by nature. Okay. When we don't energetically castrate them as mothers to little boys, right? When we don't henpeck them as wives, right? And then I get to benefit from all of that. And that closes my appreciation closes that loop. And that is sacred to me. And I was convinced, that men were the enemy. And so waking up from that gaslight is something that I have needed to write a book about. I just needed for my own damn self, like a big old diary entry, to really shout that, out, because it's a lot, to hold that process like in my own vessel.
I feel like I'm always looking for the universality of what people share, and I think what it is something I've been feeling for a long time. You get deplatformed a couple of times, and you get really offended, and then after a while, you start to sit with it, because I stopped sharing about my daughter, and people are like, "Why don't you share about your daughter?" And I was like, "Well, it was weird, because it was during the time that I got deplatformed when she was a baby, and I got really offended that." It's like, why doesn't Instagram like my daughter? It's like not really true. They don't like anybody. And then I just realized it was like, there's nothing worse than self-censorship. There's nothing worse than self-focused tyrannical measures, that what you're saying, that if you forward the gaslight that we have all bought and sold as a society, then that house husband, handyman, doesn't share from his authentic place the thing that actually restores the contract for you. And it's a wild thing to think about, right? Because it's the same dyad as the parenting, right? Because it's like, do what I say, because of all these things we've learned, right? Look how dark it is. Look at all the evil. Look at all the tyranny. And it's like, and I see you. I respect you. I believe you. And tell me more, like you engage in that dyad in a way that offers an opportunity for them to then essentially just go through the journey and then own that process more. It's so freaking amazing. You're amazing. I appreciate it. And this is, like I said, I'm not making you a hero right now, a heroine.
Please don't. You just can follow me for a few more minutes and you'll find some reason that's not the
case. I think we both know that, and I would say that it's just not a matter of if, it's a matter of when that actually comes up, but then how do you meet that? Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful thing. Kelly, I think you are a gem. You've always been this beacon that's kind of on the path, and whatever path that we're all on. And I feel like the 10 years that I've been able to observe you and learn from you and be inspired by you, mentored by you, continues today. It's a beautiful thing. And I think it's a sacred trust that if we do, as you're expressing, it's the blueprint to actually restore and reclaim a lot of what we're, divinely ordained to experience. I really appreciate you.
It's so great to walk this path with you. And find you in all of these different nooks and crannies of the process. It's awesome.
As you probably know, I'm the clinic director of the Future Generations Clinic of Chiropractic. I wanted to invite those of you in the greater San Diego area to come check us out. We expect and experience miracles in our office every day and would love for you to experience the same, as well as your family, especially your kids. This month, we're offering our new patient package for just $67 for podcast listeners. The offer retails at $349 and includes an in-depth consultation where our patients literally tell us we know more about their family's health in the first 15 minutes than virtually every doctor on their healthcare team combined. Our state-of-the-art clinical workup, including insight nervous system scans, full spine digital x-rays, and a functional exam. We also include a full report of your results, a customized plan to realize your greatest health potential, as well as your first adjustment in our office. Check out the link in the show notes for all the details and claim the offer. Love and appreciate you all.